this is Dr. Bev Knox, and we are doing our psychology exam study buddy episodes, and this is episode 15, and it's all about questions and answers for basic learning concepts and classical conditioning and operant conditioning and observational learning. So I'm actually going to give you actual questions and answers for your psychology exam. Now you are going to ace your psychology exam, so you are welcome. Okay, so let's get started. You ready? Excellent. As you know, this is a continuation from the previous episode, episode 14, when I went over the theory of learning concepts, okay? Alrighty, I'm going to try to go very slow. Psychologists define learning as the process of acquiring new information or relatively enduring behaviors. Psychologists define learning as the process of acquiring new information or relatively enduring behaviors. Acquiring new habits best illustrates the process of learning. Acquiring new habits best illustrates the process of learning. If a sea slug on repeated occasions receives an electric shock just after being squirted with water, its protective withdrawal response to a squirt of water grows stronger. This best illustrates associative learning. Conditioning is the process of learning associations. Conditioning is the process of learning associations. In classical conditioning, a stimulus is any event or situation that evokes a response. In classical conditioning, a stimulus is any event or situation that evokes a response. Jordan is frightened by the sound of a train whistle. The sound is a stimulus. Jordan is frightened by the sound of a train whistle. The sound is a stimulus. Pets who learn that the sound of an electric can opener signals the arrival of their food illustrates classical conditioning. Pets who learn that the sound of an electric can opener signals the arrival of their food illustrates classical conditioning. Children often learn to associate pushing a vending machine button with the delivery of a candy bar. This best illustrates the process underlying operant conditioning. The acquisition of mental information by observing events watching others, or through language is called cognitive learning. The acquisition of mental information by observing events, watching others, or through language is called cognitive learning. The first experimental studies of associative learning were conducted by Ivan Pavlov. The first experimental studies of associative learning were conducted by Ivan Pavlov, Pavlov. John B. Watson considered himself to be a behaviorist. John B. Watson considered himself to be a behaviorist. John B. Watson would have expressed the greatest disapproval of attempts to scientifically study whether academic achievement is influenced by a positive self-concept. Okay, and why is that? Because John B. Watson considered himself to be a behaviorist, which deals with observable behaviors. Okay. Next, the psychic secretions that Pavlov's initially considered an annoyance were conditioned responses. Next, in classical conditioning, a stimulus that elicits no response before conditioning is called a neutral stimulus. In classical conditioning, a stimulus that elicits no response before conditioning is called a neutral stimulus. Sweating in hot weather can be called an unconditioned response. In Pavlov experiments on the saliva of dogs and conditioning, the US, which is unconditioned stimulus, was the presentation of food in the dog's mouth. So in Pavlov's experiments, the unconditioned stimulus was the presentation of food in the dog's mouth. In Pavlov's experiments, the taste of food triggered the dog's salivation. Salivation to the taste of food was an unconditioned response. The taste of the food triggered the dog's salivation. Salivation to the taste of the food was an unconditioned response. In Pavlov's experiment, the sound of the tone triggered the dog's salivation. The sound of the tone triggered the dog's salivation. Salivation to the sound of the tone was a conditioned response. In Pavlov's experiments, the sound of the tone triggered the dog's salivation. Salivation to the sound of the tone was a conditioned response. A child's learned fear at the sight of a needle is a conditioned response. A child's learned fear at the sight of a needle is a conditioned response. Next, a dog salivates to the sound of a tone because the tone was regularly being associated with the delivery of food. In this case, the tone is called a conditioned stimulus. A dog salivates to the tone, to the sound of a tone, because the tone has regularly been associated with the delivery of food. In this case, the tone is called a conditioned stimulus. In classical conditioning, the conditioned stimulus signals the impending occurrence of an unconditioned stimulus. So the conditioned stimulus signals the impending occurrence of an unconditioned stimulus. Next, in classical conditioning, the NS becomes a CS after it, that's right, after it gains the signal, the impending reoccurrence of the US. Now you have to remember what all these stands for, and again I went over that in the previous episode, right? For example, NS means what? Neutral stimulus. So in classical conditioning, the neutral stimulus becomes a what? CS, which means what? Conditioned stimulus. And the impending occurrence of the, what is CS? Conditioned stimulus. But what is US? Unconditioned stimulus. That's right. See, you're remembering this stuff. What about this one? Male Japanese quail became sexually aroused by a red light that was repeatedly associated with the presentation of a female quail. The sexual arousal triggered by the red light was a CR. And what is CR? Conditioned response. Very good. Okay, a geometric figure is most likely to trigger sexual arousal if presented shortly before an appropriate US. And what is US? Unconditioned stimulus. A geometric figure is most likely to trigger sexual arousal if presented shortly before an appropriate unconditioned stimulus. Now, associating a conditioned stimulus with a new neutral stimulus can create a second, but often weaker, conditioned stimulus. This best illustrates higher order conditioning. Associating a conditioned stimulus with a new neutral stimulus can create a second conditioned stimulus. This best illustrates higher order conditioning. Okay. Michaela developed an intense fear of flying 5 years ago when she was in a plane crash. The fact that today she can again fly without distress indicates that her fear has undergone extinction. Michaela developed an intense fear of flying 5 years ago when she was in a plane crash. The fact that today she can again fly without distress indicates that her fear has undergone extinction. The reappearance after a time lapse of an extinguished conditioned response is called spontaneous recovery. The reappearance after a time lapse of an extinguished conditioned response is called spontaneous recovery. In classical conditioning, generalization refers to the tendency for the conditioned response to evoke by stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus. In classical conditioning, generalization refers to the tendency for the conditioned responses to be invoked by stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus. Now, dogs conditioned to salivate to stimulation of the thigh also begin to salivate when stimulated on other body parts. This best illustrates generalization. Next, toddlers taught to fear speed in cars may also begin to fear speed in trucks and motorcycles. This best illustrates generalization. Compared with non-abused children, those who have experienced a history of abuse show a stronger brainwave response to an unfamiliar but angry-looking face. This best illustrates generalization. Okay, next, the ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and stimuli that do not signal an unconditioned stimulus is called discrimination. The ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and stimuli that do not signal an unconditioned stimulus is called discrimination. You're doing very good. Very, very good. Okay, what about this one? Your heart may race when you are confronted by a lion, but not when you are approached by a kitten. This best illustrates the adaptive value of discrimination. Very good. Okay. Jacqueline is sexually aroused by the sight of her handsome boyfriend, but not by the sight of her equally handsome brother. This best illustrates the value of discrimination. That's right. Go figure, right? Okay. Pavlov's research on classical conditioning was important because so many different species of animals, including humans, can be classically conditioned. Okay. Just after they taste a sweet liquid, mice are injected with a drug that produces an immune response. Later, the taste of the sweet liquid by itself triggers an immune response. This best illustrates what? Classical conditioning. Very good. Watson and Rayner's study of little Albert demonstrated how specific fears may be produced through classical conditioning. After learning to fear a white rat, little Albert responded with fear to the sight of a rabbit. This best illustrates the process of generalization. After he was spanked on several occasions for spilling his milk at a restaurant, Colin became afraid to go to the restaurant. In this case, spanking was unconditioned stimuli. So the spanking was an unconditioned stimulus for Colin's fear. Okay, let's keep going. Through direct experience with animals, we come to anticipate that dogs will bark and that birds will chirp. This best illustrates associative learning. Pavlov noticed that dogs began salivation at the mere sight of the person who regularly brought food to them. For the dogs, the sight of this person was a conditioned stimulus. Blinking in response to a puff of air directed to your eye is an unconditioned response. Conditioning seldom occurs when a conditioned stimulus comes after an unconditioned stimulus. Conditioning seldom occurs when a conditioned stimulus comes after an unconditioned stimulus. A year after surviving a classroom shooting incident, Angie still responds with terror at the sight of toy guns and to the sound of balloons popping. This reaction best illustrates generalization. John B. Watson believed that psychology should be the science of observable behavior. John B. Watson believed that psychology should be the science of observable behavior. If you have a frightening experience immediately after hearing a strange sound, your fear may be aroused when you hear that sound again. This best illustrates classical conditioning. Researchers condition a flatworm to contract when exposed to light by repeating peering the light with electric shock. The electric shock is an unconditioned stimulus. After being bitten by his neighbor's dog, Miguel experienced fear at the sight of that dog, but not at the sight of other dogs. This best illustrates the process of discrimination. Learning is best defined as a relatively permanent change in the behavior of an organism due to experience. In Pavlov's original experiment, the meat served as unconditioned stimulus. In Pavlov's original experiment with dogs, the tone was initially neutral. It was a neutral stimulus. After it was paired with meat, it became, that's right, a conditioned stimulus. When a conditioned stimulus is presented without an accompanying unconditioned stimulus, extinction will soon take place. Acquiring new habits best illustrates the process of learning. Acquiring new habits best illustrates the process of learning. Jordan is frightened by the sound of a train whistle. The sound is a stimulus. Now, which form of learning is what behavior is influenced by its consequences? Operant conditioning. That's right. In operant conditioning, the behavior is influenced by consequences. Lori's thumb sucking has become habitual because she feels less anxious when she sucks her thumb. This best illustrates the process of operant conditioning. Cats received a fish reward whenever they maneuvered themselves out of an enclosed puzzle box. With successive trials, the cats escaped from the box with increasing speed. This illustrates the law of effect. B.F. Skinner's work elaborated that Thorndike had called the law of effect. So remember that Thorndike called his work the law of effect, and B.F. Skinner came afterwards and elaborated off Thorndike's work. And then he, of course, called his work operant conditioning. Now, a Skinner box is a chamber containing a bar or key that an animal can manipulate to obtain a reward. An event that strengthens the behavior it follows is called what? Reinforcement. An event that strengthens the behavior it follows is called a reinforcement. Skinner developed a behavioral technology that included a procedure known as shaping. Skinner developed a behavioral technology that included a procedure known as shaping. Shaping is what type of procedure? Shaping is an operant conditioning procedure. Shaping is an operant conditioning procedure. You would be most likely to use operant conditioning to teach a dog to retrieve sticks and balls. How would you do that? By the way, hint, hint, this question has been on my psychology exams for over 10 years. This is a stapled exam question in my psych exams when, quizzing you guys on operant conditioning. So, and you're like, what is it again? What is it again? You would be most likely to use operant conditioning to teach a dog to retrieve sticks and balls. And you see it all the time in movies, right? Where the person throws a stick and, they're like, go get it, Rover or Fido, whatever, go get the ball or the stick. And the dog runs and grabs the stick or the ball and brings it back to you. And what do? What does the person do? They reward the dog by doing what? Taking the ball or stick from its mouth and patting it on its head and saying, good boy, you're such a good boy. Or perhaps giving it a treat. That is operant conditioning. It's rewarding the behavior that they want to reoccur again. So if you want the dog to keep going and getting the ball or the stick or the newspaper or your sock, whatever, you shape the behavior by rewarding it immediately after the behavior occurs. Okay? Alrighty, let's see. Next, 5-year-old Trevor is emotionally distraught and refuses to communicate with anyone. To get him to speak, his teacher initially gives him candy for any occurrence. So anytime he speaks, the teacher gives him candy. Then only for a clearly spoken word. And finally, only for a complete sentence. The teacher is using the method of shaping. That's right, of shaping. A psychologist would be most likely to use shaping to determine whether nonverbal organisms can perceive different colors. An event or situation signaling that an operant response will be reinforced is called discriminative stimulus. Okay, let's see. Here's a good one. Any stimulus, when presented after a response, strengthens the response is called positive reinforcer. So any stimulus that, when presented after a response, strengthens the response is called a positive reinforcer. Every Sunday morning, Arnold quickly washes the family's breakfast dishes so that his father will allow him to wash his car. In this instance, washing the car is a positive reinforcer. Okay. Receiving delicious food is to escape an electric shock as positive reinforcer is to negative reinforcer. Receiving delicious food is to escape an electric shock as positive reinforcer is to negative reinforcer. Okay, here's a good one. Ready? Positive reinforcers increase the rate of operant conditioning, and negative reinforcers increase the rate of operant responding. Positive reinforcers increase the rate of operant responding, and negative reinforcers also increase the rate of operant responding. This is not a trick question because in the last episode I told you guys be very, very careful. Negative reinforcers are not the same thing as punishers or punishment. It's completely different. Okay? All right. Next, any stimulus that, when removed after a response, strengthens the response is called negative reinforcer. Any stimulus that, when removed after a response, strengthens the response is called a negative reinforcer. Okay. The taste of food and relief from a headache are both primary reinforcers. A stimulus that acquires reinforcing power through its association with a primary reinforcer is called a conditioned reinforcer. The removal of electric shock is to the receipt of money as primary reinforcer is to conditioned reinforcer. The removal of electric shock is to the receipt of money as primary reinforcer is to conditioned reinforcer. Negative reinforcers increase the rate of operant conditioning, and punishment decreases the rate of operant responding. Let me do that one again. Negative reinforcers increases the rate of operant responding, and punishments decreases the rate of operant responding. Taking away the driver's license of a reckless teen driver is intended to serve as a negative punishment. Taking away the driver's license of a reckless driver is intended to serve as a negative punishment. Learning that some responses, but not others, will be reinforced is called discrimination. Learning that some responses, but not others, will be reinforced is called discrimination. The use of physical punishment may do a lot of things, may lead to the suppression, but not the forgetting of undesirable behavior. It may also model aggression as a way of coping with problems. And physical punishment may also lead people to fear and avoid the punishing agent. All right. For purposes of effective child rearing, most psychologists favor the use of reinforcement over punishment. According to B.F. Skinner, human behavior is controlled primarily by external influences. According to B.F. Skinner, human behavior is controlled primarily by external influences. In explaining juvenile delinquency, B.F. Skinner would most likely have emphasized a faulty child rearing practices. So when explaining juvenile delinquency, B.F. Skinner would most likely have emphasized faulty child rearing practices. B.F. Skinner critics have claimed that he neglected the importance of the individual's personal freedom. B.F. Skinner believed that teaching machines could promote effective learning because they allow for both shaping and immediate reinforcement. The law of effect was most clearly highlighted by Skinner's experiments on reinforcement. Punishment decreases the rate of operant responding, And negative reinforcement increases the rate of operant responding. A word of praise is to a soothing back rub as conditioned reinforcer is to primary reinforcer. A word of praise is to a soothing back rub as primary reinforcer. That's right. So remember that. A word of praise is to a soothing back rub as conditioned reinforcer is to primary reinforcer. Jeremy wears his baseball cap backward because he noticed that his older brother does so. This illustrates the importance of modeling. Skinner is to shaping as Bandura is to modeling. In a well-known experiment, preschool children pounded and kicked a large inflated Bobo doll that an adult had just beaten on. This experiment served to illustrate the importance of observational learning. Okay. The tendency to engage in behaviors that we observe others rewarded for performing best illustrates the influence of vicarious reinforcement. An organism's ability to mentally anticipate that the US, the unconditioned stimulus, will follow a CS, a conditioned stimulus, is most likely to be highlighted by which perspective? Cognitive perspective. Okay. Children often imitate behaviors seen on television. This best illustrates the impact of modeling. Cognitive processes are important in both classical and operant conditioning. Learning by imitating others' behaviors is called observational learning. The researcher best known for studying this type of learning is Bandura, Albert Bandura. Next, classical conditioning experiments by Wagner demonstrate that an important factor in conditioning is the predictability of an association. A cognitive map is a mental representation of one's environment. A cognitive map is a mental representation of one's environment. And this is the last one. Are you ready? Regarding the impact of watching television violence on children, most researchers believe that Watching violence on television leads to aggressive behavior. And yes, this one is definitely on my psych exams. So regarding the impact of watching television violence on children, most researchers believe that watching violence on television leads to aggressive behaviors. Okay, that's it. This ends this episode of Psychology Exam Study Buddy with Dr. Bev Knox. I hope this will help you to ace your psychology exam. All right, guys, I will see you in the next episode.